It began innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. My son, Jamie, had always been a creative child. He was the sort who could entertain himself for hours with just a cardboard box and some markers. So, when he started talking about his new friend, I didn't think much of it. We had moved into the old Victorian house only a month prior, and while the charm of the place had lured me in, its wide, wraparound porch and stained glass windows, I couldn't deny the undercurrent of unease I felt from the moment we stepped through the front door. It was as though the house breathed, each creak of the floorboards and groan of the pipes hinting at something unseen. "Mommy, this is Mr. Whittaker," Jamie had chirped one afternoon, pointing to the empty corner of his room. "Oh," I replied, setting down a basket of laundry. "And who's Mr. Whittaker?" "He lives here," Jamie said matter-of-factly, as though he were reciting a fact from a storybook. "He likes tea and stories about the old days." "Well, tell Mr. Whittaker he's welcome to stay," I said, smiling at his imagination. I left it at that. Kids make things up all the time, don't they? It's a phase, I thought. He'll outgrow it. But over the next few weeks, things escalated. Jamie began having full-blown conversations with Mr. Whittaker. I'd hear him giggling softly from his room, or worse, whispering as though someone might overhear. Once, I caught him sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring intently at the corner. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Mr. Whittaker says you wouldn't understand," Jamie replied, his tone oddly serious. I tried to laugh it off. "Oh, he does he? Well, you tell him I'd like to know what's so funny, too." Jamie didn't respond. He just kept staring at the corner, his lips curling into a faint smile. At night, it was worse. I'd wake to the sound of muffled voices coming from his room. The first few times, I chalked it up to him talking in his sleep. But one night, I crept to his door and pressed my ear against it. He wasn't sleeping. "It's not her fault," Jamie said in a hushed tone. "She doesn't know, Mr. Whittaker." I opened the door, and Jamie froze. His head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with alarm. "Who are you talking to?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "No one," he mumbled, looking down at his hands. "Jamie." I said no one, he snapped, something I'd never heard from him before. I stood there, stunned. My sweet, playful little boy had been replaced by this cold, defensive stranger. The next morning, I confronted him at breakfast. "Jamie," I said, pouring milk into his cereal, "I think it's time we talk about Mr. Whittaker." He looked up at me, his spoon hovering over the bowl. "Why?" "Because I don't think he's real," I said gently. Jamie's expression darkened. "He is real. You're just mad because he doesn't like you." "Jamie, he's imaginary." "That's okay. Lots of kids have imaginary friends." He dropped his spoon with a clatter. "He's not imaginary. He's real, and he says you don't belong here." The force of his words left me speechless. Jamie pushed his chair back and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving his breakfast untouched. Later that day, while cleaning out the attic, I came across a box of old photographs. Most were black and white images of faceless ancestors and long-forgotten moments, but one photo stopped me cold. It was of a man, tall and thin, with a long face and piercing eyes. He wore an old-fashioned suit and a stern expression that sent a chill down my spine. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were the words, "Whittaker, 1924. My heart began to pound as I stared at the photograph. This was impossible. I took the photo downstairs and showed it to Jamie. "Jamie," I said, my voice trembling, "is this Mr. Whittaker?" His eyes lit up, and a wide smile spread across his face. "Yeah. That's him. That's Mr. Whittaker." I dropped the photograph. "Where did you see him?" I demanded. "In my room," Jamie said, his tone casual, as though this were the most normal thing in the world. He said he likes the way it looks now. Except for the curtains. He hates the curtains. My blood ran cold. That night, I couldn't sleep. The photograph of Mr. Whittaker haunted me, its details etched into my mind. Those piercing eyes, the slight smirk as though he were in on a secret only he knew, it was unnerving. Jamie had been so sure, so calm when he recognized the man. How could he have known him? The house was still, save for the occasional groan of wood settling under its own weight. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear any sound from Jamie's room. Around midnight, the whispering started again. I threw back the covers and crept down the hall, my bare feet silent against the floor. The faint murmur of Jamie's voice seeped through his closed door. "No, I don't think she would," he was saying, his tone quiet but firm. "She doesn't like that kind of stuff." I swallowed hard and opened the door. Jamie was sitting upright in bed, facing the far corner of the room. His head turned sharply toward me as the door creaked open. "Mommy," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of surprise and guilt. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, stepping into the room. "No one," he muttered, pulling the covers up to his chin. "Jamie," I said firmly, my eyes darting to the corner he'd been staring at. It was empty, but the air felt heavier there, as though something unseen lingered. "Tell me the truth." He hesitated, then whispered, "It was Mr. Whittaker." My stomach turned. "Jamie, there's no one here but us." "Yes, there is," he said, his voice trembling. "He's right there. He doesn't want you to see him." "Why not?" I asked, my throat dry. Jamie's gaze dropped to his hands. "Because he says you won't like him. And he doesn't like you, either." The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Jamie was at school, so I had the house to myself. I went up to the attic, determined to find answers. The box of photographs was still there, and I sifted through it again. There were more pictures of Mr. Whittaker, always standing off to the side, his expression unwavering. In one photo, he stood on the front porch of the house, leaning against the railing. Something about his posture unsettled me. He looked too relaxed, too comfortable, as though he still belonged here. Then I found the newspaper clippings. The first headline sent a jolt through me. "Local man disappears from Victorian home, 1924. The article described a man named Henry Whittaker, a reclusive scholar who had moved into the house in the early 1900s. He was known for being eccentric, rarely venturing into town. One day, he simply vanished. No trace of him was ever found. Another clipping detailed the strange occurrences reported by subsequent owners: footsteps in the attic, doors slamming on their own, cold spots in the hallways. The most chilling article was an account from the family who lived here in the 1970s. Their young daughter claimed to have an imaginary friend named Mr. Whittaker. According to the article, she described him as a tall man with funny clothes who told her secrets. The family moved out after the girl began having violent night terrors. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place. Jamie wasn't making this up. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but every shadow in the house seemed longer, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When Jamie came home, I tried to act normal. We played a board game after dinner, and I tucked him into bed with his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Mommy?" he asked as I turned off the light. "Yes, sweetheart. Mr. Whittaker says he's sorry he scared you." I froze. "What do you mean?" "He says you found the picture. He didn't mean to make you upset." "Jamie," I said, my voice shaking, "I need you to tell me the truth. Is Mr. Whittaker real?" He nodded solemnly. "He says he's been here a long time. He likes me, Mommy. He says I remind him of his little boy." I stared at him, my heart pounding. His little boy. Jamie nodded again, then rolled over, pulling the covers up to his chin. "Good night, Mommy," he said softly, as though we'd just been discussing something mundane. I backed out of the room, leaving the door ajar. That night, I slept with the lights on. The next morning, I woke to find Jamie sitting at the breakfast table, swinging his legs and humming to himself. His carefree demeanor should have comforted me, but after the night before, it only unnerved me further. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, placing a bowl of cereal in front of him. "Aha," he replied, spooning Fruit Loops into his mouth. "Mr. Whittaker says you should stop looking for stuff about him." My hand froze mid-air, the coffee mug trembling in my grip. "What do you mean, Jamie?" "He says it's not good to dig up old things. It makes him mad." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to keep my voice steady. "What happens when he gets mad?" Jamie shrugged, his focus still on his cereal. "He says it's not me he's worried about." I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. There was something deliberate in the way Jamie spoke, as if Mr. Whittaker were speaking through him. Determined not to be intimidated, I decided to call a local historian. I remembered the name from one of the newspaper articles, Margaret Hauser, an archivist specializing in the town's history. After a few rings, she answered, her voice warm but curious. "Henry Whittaker," she said when I mentioned his name. "Oh, yes, I know the story. Are you calling about the house?" "Yes," I admitted, glancing toward the hallway where Jamie played with his toys. "We live here now, and strange things have been happening." Margaret hesitated. "I've heard stories over the years. Families who lived there often complained of unusual activity, particularly centered around children." "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "Henry Whittaker lost his own child, a son, shortly before his disappearance. The boy fell ill, and by all accounts, Henry was devastated. He became obsessed with the idea of contacting him. People said he dabbled in spiritualism, holding seances and experimenting with, well, things best left alone." My stomach churned. "And then he vanished?" "Yes. Some say he succeeded in contacting his son, but at a terrible cost. Others believe he simply went mad and ran off. But there's no evidence of where he went. No body, nothing." I didn't know what to say. "If you'd like," Margaret continued, "I can dig up some more information for you. There's bound to be something in the archives." "Please," I said quickly, giving her my number. Before hanging up, she added, "Be careful. If the stories are true, Mr. Whittaker isn't someone you want to upset." That evening, I found Jamie in the living room, drawing with crayons. His picture was simple but unsettling, a stick figure man standing next to a child in front of a house. The man's figure was much taller, with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the boy. "Who's this?" I asked, sitting beside him. "It's me and Mr. Whittaker," Jamie said without looking up. "Why are his arms so long?" "Because he says he wants to keep me close," Jamie replied matter-of-factly. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Jamie, I don't think you should talk to Mr. Whittaker anymore." He stopped drawing and looked at me with a frown. "Why not?" "Because he's not real, sweetheart. And if he is, he might not be safe." Jamie's expression darkened. "He is real, Mommy. And he says you don't get to decide that." Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. "Stay here," I told Jamie, who simply went back to his drawing. As I climbed the stairs, the air grew colder. The sound had come from Jamie's room, and as I pushed the door open, I was greeted by a bone-chilling sight. The small wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, was moving on its own. Back and forth, the creak of the wood filling the silence. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The chair stopped. I stood frozen, staring at the empty seat, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, as if in response, the door behind me slammed shut with such force that the walls seemed to tremble. I screamed and bolted for the door, fumbling with the knob. It wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I shouted, banging on the door. Behind me, the rocking chair creaked again. Slowly, I turned, and my blood ran cold. Standing in the corner was a shadowy figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by darkness. But the eyes, piercing and unrelenting, were unmistakable. "Leave us alone!" I cried, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my plea. Then, in an instant, it was gone. The door flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. Jamie was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale. "Mr. Whittaker says you shouldn't yell at him," he said softly. I grabbed Jamie by the shoulders. "Listen to me, Jamie. Mr. Whittaker isn't your friend. He's dangerous." Jamie shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, he's not. He's nice to me. He says he's only mean to people who try to take me away from him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My grip tightened. "Jamie, I will never let anyone take you away. Do you hear me?" Jamie nodded, but his gaze drifted past me, toward the staircase. "He says that's what the others said too." I couldn't shake Jamie's words, "That's what the others said too." Who were the others? How many people had been lured into this web of horror before us? I felt as though the house itself was alive, its walls pulsing with the weight of secrets too dark to fathom. That night, I stayed up long after Jamie fell asleep, researching everything I could about Henry Whittaker. Margaret had promised to get back to me with more details, but I couldn't wait. I scoured old forums, digitized archives, and obscure blogs until my eyes burned. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a mention of an old journal, purportedly belonging to Whittaker himself. According to a user on a paranormal forum, the journal had been found in the house during renovations in the 1980s. It was said to contain ramblings about grief, seances, and an obsession with bringing his son back. The journal had disappeared shortly after its discovery, but the forum hinted at a possibility. The last known owner had been a man named Harold Thatcher, a collector of paranormal artifacts who lived one town over. The next morning, I dropped Jamie off at school and drove to Harold Thatcher's address. The house was a ramshackle old thing, its yard overgrown with weeds and a sagging porch that looked ready to collapse. I knocked on the door, my nerves frayed. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with wild white hair and a weathered face. "Are you Harold Thatcher?" I asked. "Who's asking?" His voice was gruff, suspicious. "My name's Lisa. I live in the old Whittaker house, and I heard you might have something of his, a journal." At the mention of the journal, Harold's eyes narrowed. "That thing," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's nothing but trouble. Please," I pleaded. "I think it might help me understand what's happening in my home." He studied me for a moment, then sighed and opened the door wider. The journal was resting on a shelf in his cluttered living room. Bound in cracked leather, it looked as old as the house itself. Harold handed it to me reluctantly. "Take it," he said. "But don't say I didn't warn you. That thing, it's cursed." Whittaker was a broken man, obsessed with the dead. He didn't care who he hurt, as long as he got what he wanted. "What did he want?" I asked. "His son," Harold said simply. But something went wrong. He opened a door, sure enough, but not to where he thought. He let something else in. Back at home, I opened the journal at the dining table, my hands trembling. The pages were yellowed and filled with cramped, almost frantic handwriting. At first, the entries were mundane, detailing Whittaker's life in the house and his grief after losing his son, Thomas. But as the pages went on, the tone grew darker, more desperate. Whitaker described conducting séances, hiring mediums, and eventually experimenting with rituals he claimed were ancient and forbidden. One entry stood out, written in shaky letters. "I saw him tonight. My boy, my Thomas. But he is not whole. Something else clings to him, a shadow I cannot banish. It watches me, waiting. I must finish the ritual, no matter the cost." The final entries were nearly illegible, but one phrase appeared again and again: "The keeper will not leave." I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. The keeper, was that what Whitaker had summoned? Was that what had taken hold of this house, of Jamie? As if on cue, the room grew colder. I turned to see Jamie standing in the doorway, his expression blank. "What are you doing, Mommy?" he asked softly. "Just reading," I said, trying to sound casual. "How was school?" "Fine," he replied, walking toward me. But there was something off about the way he moved, too deliberate, too steady. He stopped in front of the table and rested his small hands on the journal. "You shouldn't read this," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Jamie. Mr. Whitaker says it's not for you. It's for us." I grabbed the journal, pulling it away from him. "This is not for you, Jamie. You don't understand what it is." For the first time, his face twisted with anger. He said, "Don't touch it." Jamie screamed, his voice echoing unnaturally through the room. The lights flickered, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low, guttural hum. I stumbled back, clutching the journal to my chest. Jamie's expression softened, but it wasn't relief I felt, it was dread. He tilted his head, looking past me. "He's here," Jamie whispered. A loud crash sounded from the living room. I ran to the doorway, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the rocking chair, the one from Jamie's room, now sat in the middle of the floor, slowly moving back and forth. "Leave us alone," I shouted, clutching the journal like a shield. The rocking chair stopped abruptly. For a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then Jamie's voice broke it. "He says he's not leaving," he said calmly, standing behind me. "He says this is his house, and he's taking me with him." "No." I spun around, gripping Jamie's shoulders. "You're my son, and no one is taking you anywhere." But Jamie's eyes weren't his own anymore. They were darker, colder, filled with something ancient and malevolent. "You don't understand," he said in a voice that wasn't his. "He's already taken me." I staggered back from Jamie, my mind reeling. The boy standing before me wasn't my son, not fully. His small frame seemed weighed down by an invisible force, and those dark, chilling eyes stared through me as if I were the intruder. "Jamie," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I know you're still in there. You have to fight this. Don't let him take you." A flicker of something familiar passed across his face, like a shadow of my little boy trying to break free. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that cold, detached expression. "He says you can't stop him," Jamie said. "The keeper doesn't leave. He never does." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, grasping for answers, for anything that might break whatever hold this entity had on Jamie. My hands clutched the journal tighter. "Fine," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "If the keeper wants me to leave, then he'll have to make me. But he's not taking you." Jamie tilted his head, his lips curling into a faint smile. "That's what they all said." The room seemed to darken around us, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The house groaned, as though it were alive and responding to my defiance. I backed away toward the front door, my eyes darting between Jamie and the shifting shadows. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. "Mommy?" Jamie called as I reached the door. I turned, hoping for a glimmer of my son. But his voice was flat, devoid of warmth. "He doesn't like it when you run." I bolted from the house, clutching the journal like it was a lifeline. The cold January air stung my skin, but I barely noticed. I got in the car and drove without a destination, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. After 20 minutes of aimless driving, I pulled into a deserted parking lot and parked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I opened the journal again, flipping through its pages for anything that might help me. Near the back, I found a passage that sent a chill down my spine. The keeper is bound to the house, a guardian and a jailer. To banish him, the tether must be severed. But beware, the keeper does not release his charge willingly. He will claim another if given the chance. Another? Did that mean Jamie? I scanned the surrounding text, my heart racing. The tether, what was it? Some kind of object? A place? I needed more information. I reached for my phone and called Margaret. Lisa, she answered, her voice thick with concern. What's wrong? I explained everything in a rush, my words tumbling over one another. Margaret listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a long pause. I think the tether is what keeps the keeper bound to this world, she said finally. It could be something he used during the rituals, a personal belonging, a focus for his energy. If you find it and destroy it, that might break the connection. And Jamie? I asked, my voice trembling. If the keeper has already latched onto him, Margaret hesitated. You'll have to act quickly. The longer the keeper stays, the stronger his hold becomes. I returned to the house just after sunset, armed with a lighter, a can of kerosene, and a desperate plan. The air felt heavier as I stepped through the front door, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my fear. Jamie? I called, my voice echoing through the house. No answer. I climbed the stairs to his room, the journal tucked under my arm. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, but the rocking chair sat in its usual corner, rocking gently back and forth as though someone had just risen from it. My gaze fell to the floor, where Jamie's crayons were scattered around a new drawing. This one was darker, the lines jagged and chaotic. It showed the house engulfed in flames, with a tall figure standing unharmed in the center. Jamie? I called again, my voice cracking. He's not here, came a deep voice from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure from the shadows now stood in the doorway, tall and imposing, his face obscured but his eyes, those piercing, hateful eyes, locked onto mine. Leave him alone. I shouted, clutching the journal. You can't have him. The figure tilted its head, a cruel smile curling its lips. He belongs to me now. Just as the others did. The air in the room grew icy, and the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe around the figure. I backed toward the corner, scanning the room for anything that might serve as the tether. Then I saw it, a small, wooden box sitting on Jamie's dresser. It hadn't been there before. My instincts screamed that this was it. I lunged for the box, but the figure moved faster, its long, shadowy arms stretching toward me. I felt an invisible force slam into my chest, knocking me to the floor. Do not touch it, the figure growled, its voice reverberating through the room. But I wasn't going to let this thing win. Gritting my teeth, I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the box. It was heavier than it looked, and as I opened the lid, a wave of nausea washed over me. Inside was a collection of strange items, a lock of hair, a tarnished locket, and a child's wooden toy. This was it. Stop, the figure roared, advancing on me. I fumbled with the kerosene can, pouring its contents over the box and its contents. The air filled with the acrid smell of fuel as the figure loomed closer, its movements growing more frantic. You will not take him from me, it bellowed. I'm not taking him, I said, flicking the lighter and holding the flame over the box. I'm saving him. The figure lunged just as I dropped the flame. The fire roared to life, consuming the box and its contents in an instant. The room shook violently, and the figure let out a deafening scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the house. The shadows recoiled, twisting and dissipating as the flames grew brighter. I clung to the wall, shielding my face from the heat and the cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the house fell silent. I turned to see Jamie standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and clear. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice small and frightened. I dropped to my knees, pulling him into my arms. "It's okay, baby," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It's over. He's gone." But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching. The house was unnervingly quiet after the fire. Even as the smoke from the burned box cleared, the oppressive weight that had hung in the air seemed to lift, leaving only a fragile stillness. Jamie clung to me, his small body trembling. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice muffled against my shoulder, "is Mr. Whittaker really gone?" I didn't have the heart to tell him I wasn't sure. Instead, I tightened my arms around him and kissed the top of his head. "He's gone," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. "He can't hurt us anymore." But deep inside, I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few days cleaning and watching Jamie like a hawk. At first, he seemed like his old self again, bright, cheerful, and bursting with his usual boundless imagination. But every so often, I'd catch him staring into space, his brows furrowed, as though listening to something I couldn't hear. I dismissed it as leftover fear. We'd been through a lot. It would take time for both of us to heal. But then, the dreams started. The first one came 3 nights after I burned the box. In it, I was standing in Jamie's room, staring at the rocking chair. It moved back and forth, creaking rhythmically, though the room was empty. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize in the seat, a tall, thin man with piercing eyes and an all-too-familiar smirk. "You think it's over," he said, his voice low and mocking. "But I'm always here." I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Jamie was asleep in his bed, but I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the image of those eyes. The next day, Jamie was unusually quiet. He picked at his breakfast, his usual chatter replaced by a sullen silence. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nothing," he mumbled, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. "Jamie, you can tell me anything. You know that, right?" He hesitated, then looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "He's not gone, Mommy." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "He's still in the house," Jamie whispered. "He's just, quieter now. Watching." I wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was just his imagination, but the words wouldn't come. That night, I sat in the living room, the journal open on the coffee table in front of me. I'd read through it so many times that I practically had it memorized, but I was desperate for something I might have missed. My gaze kept returning to one line: "The keeper does not release his charge willingly. He will claim another if given the chance." I thought I had severed the tether by destroying the box. But what if I hadn't? What if the keeper had found another way to stay, another tether? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. Jamie. The dreams grew worse. Night after night, I saw Mr. Whittaker, his shadow stretching across the house like a dark stain. He never spoke after that first dream, he simply stared at me, his presence a chilling reminder that this was far from over. One morning, Jamie came into the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "He talks to me in my dreams," Jamie said quietly. "He says I don't belong with you. That I belong with him." "No," I said firmly, pulling him into my arms. "You belong with me. No one else. Do you understand?" Jamie nodded, but his small body felt so fragile, so breakable in my arms. Desperate for help, I called Margaret again. When I told her what was happening, she was silent for a long moment before finally saying, "Lisa, I don't think the keeper's power is tied solely to objects. I think it's tied to the house itself, and to the people inside it." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You need to leave," she said. "Take Jamie and get as far away from that house as you can. It's the only way to break his hold completely." I didn't need to be told twice. That night, I packed up everything I could carry, waking Jamie gently and bundling him into the car. "Where are we going?" he asked sleepily. "Somewhere safe," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. As I drove away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching us go. I pushed the accelerator harder, my heart racing. We stayed with a friend in a neighboring town for the next few weeks while I found a new place to live. Jamie seemed to brighten with each passing day, his laughter returning, his nightmares fading. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't entirely free. It wasn't until months later, after we had settled into a new apartment, that I found the last sign of Mr. Whittaker. I was unpacking a box of Jamie's toys when I found a small, wooden figurine tucked at the bottom. It was a crude carving of a man with elongated arms and hollow eyes. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. "Jamie," I called, my voice trembling. He appeared in the doorway, his expression curious. "Where did this come from?" I asked, holding up the figurine. Jamie's face darkened, and for a moment, his eyes looked almost distant. "He says hi," Jamie said softly. The figurine slipped from my fingers and hit the floor.